This is where it all began. This is where we started. Way back in 1972, Pong arrived at the scene of a market that barely existed to become an absolute phenomenon. It showed that electronic entertainment can evoke a sense of joy and a competitive spirit among us. It had players focused on the Pong stick on their side and the puck that was comprised merely of a few pixels on screen. Pong is a representative of where we started as an industry in terms of art and graphics. It has been 50 years since, and with the rapid advancements in technology, the industry that is ever so determined by said technology is sure to have come a long way. Which sounds a bit obvious. Today, technology facilitates all kinds of graphical fidelity and art style, from something photorealistic to something cartoonish or colorful. But take a step back and look at where we began and where we are today, and you'd have yourself thinking, boy, have we come a long way. To understand how video game art got so far, we need to go right back to the early days of video games and chronicle the advancements in graphics, the technology that drives it, and the challenges that occur during the creative process. Welcome to the two-part video series on understanding art and graphics in video games. One of the first video games I had the pleasure of playing was a version of Space Invaders. The 2D sprites on the screen depicted a variety of enemy spaceships on top of the screen, while the player's ship, which I controlled, was at the bottom, depicting a kind of a standoff before the battle began. At the time, those 2D sprites and their subtle movements in space were enough to trigger the imagination of the player and project a battle on a scale of a blockbuster movie in their heads. Then there was a frenetic back and forth in Pac-Man, where the player switched from being hunted to being the hunter for a brief moment when the enemies turned blue. At that time, the goal of consuming the dots on the screen did not matter. The player wanted to chase because he was tired of being chased. The player wanted revenge. It is safe to say that the game's design had a lot to do with how the player felt during Space Invaders and Pac-Man. But it is the visuals that gave context, that gave shape to the scenario at hand. And this was way back in the days when gaming as we know it was still taking its baby steps. But as compelling as these games were, they were merely more than a scenario for the player. Once the player beat the level, the next level was a variation of the previous one with some minor changes. But the success of these games was undeniable. So companies followed suit. Eventually, too many companies were making hundreds of games that lacked meaningful content or much visual distinction between one another. Then it all came to an abrupt end during the great video game crash of 1983. The once always on high demand item had lost its charm, and the home console market was almost dead. A couple of years later, a game featuring a certain Italian plumber made its way from Japan and changed everything. Super Mario Bros. Is still regarded as one of the classics for a reason. It was due to the creators' vision of what they had for the game. They took all that was known about computer graphics at the time and hit the reset button to start with a fresh new outlook. And this could be said for all Nintendo Entertainment System games that came after. Super Mario featured the same 8-bit graphics but in a different light. The game now had a detailed model of a character with different types of enemies, mushrooms, a princess, castles, a menacing villain, and above all, a story. And not to forget my favorite part of the game, secret power-ups. Super Mario Bros. Helped revitalize an industry to glory after almost being extinct, and in the process, set a new standard for graphics in video games. And the industry has never looked back since. So, to no one's surprise, graphics in games only got better with newer console generations. But Super Mario was only the beginning even in the NES era. Games like Contra, Battletoads, Castlevania 3, and Batman Return of the Joker pushed visuals to a whole new level. Then, 2D graphics took on a whole new avatar with the 16-bit systems in the form of the Super NES and the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. These systems showed that 2D sprites can create works of art that really sell the game's setting. Take Chrono Trigger for example. That opening level with the town fair has a surreal sense of atmosphere to it, and your interaction with the characters and events on screen do a fantastic job of setting up the story for the rest of the game in ways never seen before. Or let's look at just about any level from Street Fighter 2, the new challenges. Whether it's a glamour of Vegas, the market streets of China, or a club in Jamaica, the player was constantly in awe. It's a true testament to the work done in these games, with all the technological limitations at the time, that these games have stood the test of time and look as enduring today as they did decades ago. But this is an industry that constantly evolves. In the early to mid-90s, 3D was the buzzword. And 3D graphics made its way to games when the average person was still trying to contemplate the concept of 3D spaces in a digital world. But early 3D was not without its problems. Although technically mind-blowing with its new possibilities, the aesthetics left much to be desired, at least for some. I still distinctly remember preferring Marley from Chrono Trigger over the 3D Lara Croft from the first game as a little kid. But yeah, Lara did have fancier moves. It wasn't until the tail end of the 90s that 3D truly began to shine. Tekken 3 on the very first PlayStation was the most beautiful game of its time, 3D or otherwise. The visuals only got better with the next generation of consoles, and visual works of art like Okami, Shadow of the Colossus, Super Mario World, and God of War 2 saw their releases in the PS2 era. The trend continued into the PS3 and Xbox 360 era, with visuals getting better with each generation. As someone who has seen the evolution of graphics in most of its stages, there were numerous occasions where I thought we've hit the ceiling, that graphics can't get any better. When I first saw Tekken 3, Uncharted 1, Resident Evil 5, or the NFS reboot from 2015, I thought that graphics just can't get any better. But we are still being proven wrong even today with games like Hellblade 2 on the horizon. There is something we missed while discussing the trend in 3D graphics across consoles. The fact that good-looking graphics is just one side of the visual spectrum, and the art style is a whole other thing. I brought up Okami while discussing PS2. Okami is still a visually appealing game today, even when launched on an old PS2, than say Hitman Blood Money, which was released the same year and was lauded for its graphics at the time. This is because Okami's art style was not after the realism that 3D graphics brought, but had a style of its own. The game simply used the 3D graphics engine to render its own style. The same could be said about Beautiful Joe, yet another game with a fantastic art style. I bring this up because back in the PS3 and Xbox 360 era, there was a very notable shift in the industry. Unlike the days of the PS2 and the ones that preceded it, games were now far more expensive to make with the advanced 3D graphics that the new machines were capable of. This resulted in hundreds of small-scale studios either closing or being bought by bigger companies. There were two knock-on effects due to this. Systems like microtransactions made their way into games, so companies can recoup their budgets. And the second, and more notable one, was the rise of indies. Indie games, or games made by independent developers, are a boon for the industry as they bring an unprecedented amount of creativity to the table. These smaller scale games rarely sought out realistic graphics and instead favored refreshing new art styles. These games brought a whole new dimension to the discussion and study of art in games. These games once again hit the reset button on the perception of art or graphics, like Super Mario did way back in 1985. With the indie scene kicking into high gear, graphics in games got more vibrant and games have been bursting with personality ever since. Coming back to the big players in the AAA space, graphics keep getting better by the day. and with it, the complexity of the games gets higher alongside the budget to make these games. This brings us to today, where graphics in video games pretty much drive the gaming hardware market and thus affect the player and the creator directly. We are in the 9th generation of console today, and in the PC space where generations don't really matter, GPUs and other gaming peripherals have evolved to form a thriving market of their own, all in the service of a few key things, including graphics and frame rates, among others. While it has had its ups and downs, this has evolved into a great hobby for enthusiasts and a great way to unwind for the millions of gamers who play and enjoy these games. Where will graphics go from here is anyone's guess. But knowing that it will only get better, I'm all in for what is to come. So that was the evolution of graphics in video games. But what does it take to bring these visuals to life? What are the challenges faced by the developers? And what are the common issues with graphics in games? Let's dive into the technical aspects of graphics in part 2 of this video series. Make sure to stay with XE for that and more. Until then, I'm Ishaq. You take care, stay safe, and keep gaming.